Good morning, kids, or good afternoon, or good evening. This, if everything goes like we planned, will be about the last time I'm going to be doing this here, because next Sunday, at least after this weekend here, we'll be regularly back to Sunday school again. And for grades 3, 4, 5, and 6, we'll be back up in room 510. Upstairs, our old room. Things will be a little different. We'll all be together for the lesson instead of dividing up again, and you'll get to hear the different teachers instead of me, because maybe I've been too boring after all this time now, okay? So we'll be doing that next Sunday. But if you cannot come on Sunday, your parents decide it's not a good idea or something else, let us know, and we're still going to record whoever teaches on Sunday, and then we'll let you get it. We're going to have a special link, so it won't be on our regular posting services. You have to tell us you'll want to see it, and then we'll send you the link when we put that video up so you can watch it then, all right? And that way you can still keep up with the lessons. When we get upstairs, we're going to pick up right where we left off in our different lessons. So I hope to see most of you there, and your favorite teachers will be up there too. And if we got anybody in kindergarten and first grade watching today, you'll be back down here in the choir room, and you'll have your class down in here with some of the old teachers there too, all right? Okay, our lesson today. Well, let's talk about where we've been. All right? So we got this chart here, which I can't hang on to, that started way back with Moses down here. And we saw all sorts of things happen with Moses, and we saw the kingdom get established. King David was the second king. His son Solomon built the temple. And then after that, the kingdom split. That's why our path goes a different way right there. There was a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. Remember their names? The northern kingdom was still called Israel. And the southern kingdom took on the name of the biggest tribe down there, Judah. All right, so we had Israel and Judah. Which one of those didn't last as long? Israel. Israel here split off. They didn't have any good kings the whole time after they split off. And eventually, because of all the idols they were worshiping and all the other things they did that God didn't want them to do, they got taken over by the Assyrians. All right? The southern kingdom, Judah, had some good kings, had a lot of bad kings, and they'd have a good king, and then have some more bad kings, and they'd have a good king, if you remember all those kings. Yeah, I got tired talking to them. All right? But they eventually had the same problem. They got taken over by the next world empire named Babylon. They were taken over. People were taken captive. People were killed. They destroyed Jerusalem. They drug them out of there. They destroyed the temple. Some people got taken back to Babylon. People from other countries got brought in to their land. And you would think they never come back again. But God made promises that after 70 years, they'd be allowed to come back. And during that 70 years, we watched a guy named Daniel that was just a little guy, a teenager during this time. When they came and invaded, he got taken back to Babylon. And he served there for 70 years before God finally said, you can go back to Babylon. One of the kings, now another king from another empire named Persia, that came the next empire after Babylon, gave a rule, said they could go back home. And they went back home and they rebuilt the temple. Took them longer than it should have because they stopped halfway through, worked some things out. But they're back in the country now. Some of them are. All right? But not all of them. We're going to talk today about somebody that didn't go back at that time. We don't know exactly when this happened because the kings that they try and base history on during this time, they overlapped and they have different names at different parts of the empire. So we're not exactly sure when this story happened. But it's a story about a woman named Hadassah. Anybody know her name? Hadassah. No, we know her better by another name. We know her better by the name Esther, or as we'll find out in our story today, Queen Esther. All right? So we're going to look in a book that has her name. And of course, when we get a new book in the Bible, what do? We get out our handy dandy Bible chart. This is our handy dandy Bible chart, all right? And we've talked about that the books here, that are the books in the Bible, the books in the Bible aren't in the order which they happened exactly. The Jews put together the Old Testament a long time ago, and they chose different ways to do it. They put the books of Moses first. Those are in order, all right? And they got books of history, and those are pretty close to being in order. They got this section over here called poetry, and actually the book of Job is called poetry, so they put it here, but it happened way back here, probably in the book of Genesis, from there as we can tell, all right? And then we have the prophets down here, and some of these prophets wrote during the time of the kings and time of Chronicles here, but some of them wrote later. Some of them we're going to look at here in a little bit in our future lessons. So they're not exactly in the order they came in, but in this section of history here, they're pretty close to the right order. And we're going to look at the last book in history, Esther. People think she might be the last book in there of history, the last record we have before we start the New Testament. And we got some other prophets we're going to look at, but as far as history goes, Esther might have been the last book. It's either her or Nehemiah, and we're going to look at his story in a couple weeks. So we got Esther, Queen Esther. And it's an interesting story how she got to be queen. Now we're going to pick it up because right now the world empire is still Persia. We have this new king called Xerxes, and he had a queen, and he put her away. There was this story. He wanted her to do something. She thought it was beneath her to do it, which it probably was. She had good reasons. So she didn't do it, and his counselors talked him into he should put her away because she doesn't make him look good. So now the king needs a new queen, and they have this thing set up. His counselors did, the people that stand around the king and tell him what to do. Yeah, help him figure things out. They thought they'd do this, and they set up what amounts to kind of like a beauty pageant. So they went through the kingdom and rounded up all the young, pretty women they could. And we don't think they probably had much choice on whether they were coming or not. And somewhere in that, they rounded up this woman called Hadassah. But that was her Jewish name. She was one of the Jews, still living in there in the capital city of Persia. We don't know why she didn't go back home. People didn't know she was a Jew, especially the people that took her to see the king. And she didn't want them to find out. Matter of fact, her parents were already dead. She was being raised by her uncle Mordecai, and he told her, you better not tell him you're a Jew. Change your name. Go by the name of Esther. So for the rest of the story, we'll know her as Esther, because that's the name she chose here. We don't know whether she went by that already, like Daniel had two names. Daniel and his other name was Belteshazzar. And Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So she might have had another name anyways, all right? So that's the story there in this book. The king needed a new queen. So they have this beauty contest. So they round up all the women and they take them into the special part of the palace. The palace then was called Shushan, and they had this thing they called the House of Women. And they brought these young girls in there, and they had let's read about what happened. Esther chapter 2, all right, we're skipping chapter 1. Esther chapter 2. Hopefully you found the book of Esther. It's a little hard to find. It's a small book, but you go past Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah. And then you get to Esther. All right? So hopefully you got your Bibles today, because we use them all the time. And you're in the book of Esther. We're going to read, starting out, verse 8. All right? So what happened when Esther got to the palace? So it came to pass when the king's command and his decree was heard, and when many maidens, it's these young girls there, were gathered together to Shushan, that's the name of the palace, to the custody of Haggai. Esther was brought into the king's house, into the custody of Haggai, keeper of the woman. So this guy Haggai here was in charge of this house of woman. He was made sure they kept order. He was teaching them what they need to know to be queen and making sure they had what they needed. All right? So she's one of these girls in the building. Young woman there. Probably didn't want to be there, but she's one of them. And something interesting happens. We've seen this before. All right? I'm going to read the verse. You think about in the Bible where we had some other guys that had pretty much the same thing happen to them, okay? And the maiden pleased him. So that means Esther was pleasing her keeper there, Haggai. And she obtained kindness of him, and he speedily gave her the things for purification, with such things as belongeth to her, and 7 maidens, and out of the king's house, and he preferred her and her maids to the best place in the house of woman. So this guy that was in charge of the woman liked her so much, probably so easy to get along with, so polite, even though she was in this bad situation, that he gave her the best room in the house. And she got 7 maids, all right? Now, who else in the Bible we've seen got favored like that? I can think of 2, all right? If you remember way back to the story of Joseph, even though he was sold as a slave by his brothers and he got put in the slave market and sold to a guy named Potiphar, Potiphar, his boss, really liked what he was doing. And he kept promoting him up there. And even when his wife, Potiphar's wife, accused him of something terrible, instead of killing him, which he could have because he was a slave, he threw him into prison instead because he liked Joseph. I know, it's a strange way to like somebody. And in the prison people liked him the best. And he was in charge of the prison after a while. And then again, when Pharaoh found him, helped him with his dream, he got in charge of the famine relief program there for Egypt, he rose up to the top again. So we saw that with Joseph. And we saw it just a few weeks ago with Daniel. Daniel was taken out of his home country, brought into another country, went off to the school to be a good Babylonian there to work for the king. And everybody there liked him, including the guy that they asked to have vegetables and water instead of the king's food. Because he liked the guys, because they were easy to get along with, he helped them out. If you find somebody that can't get along with anybody, something's probably wrong. But that's not the case here with Esther. She was liked by the guy that was in charge of her there, all right? So they had this beauty contest, and man, it was a chore. They spent a whole year getting ready. They had this beauty regimen they went through. I know you guys think your sisters spend so long in the bathroom getting ready to go to church, right? Well, they spent a year getting ready. They had this special 6-month program and then another 6 months with their beautifying stuff and their perfumes, okay? I don't know if they had classes on how to be a good queen there. But that's what they were doing at that time. Took them a year to have this contest. Who do you think won? Let's read it. Esther chapter 2, verse 17. So each one of these girls gets brought in front of the king. And it turns out, and the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the others, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. All right? So Esther is the new queen. She won the contest. So she gets her own special place in the palace, another apartment there. She keeps her maids with her. She's got it pretty well made. Set up for life here, all right? We got pictures of her. This is what they thought Esther would look like. And this right here is her uncle Mordecai that we've talked about so far. Now, let's talk some more about Mordecai. This is an interesting thing that happened. He got the job of working at the door of the king's palace. At a king's palace, you got people coming and going all the time. They have to make deliveries, for the food to feed everybody that lives and works there. and you get the head counselors coming and going. Someone has to be in charge of the door all the time. Mordecai got that job. Now, he might have had it before Esther got taken there, or he might have tried to get it after Esther was taken there so he could be as close as he could get to her to keep track of how she was doing. All right? So he's there at the gate. Works there at the gate for the king. There's two other guys that work there. Let's read about this too. So this is going to be 3 verses that we're going to read. So you have to pay attention and read along. So we're going to chapter 2 still, verses 21, 22, and 23. My voice is giving out. Well, let's give it a try here. In those days, while Mordecai sat at the king's gate, 2 of the king's chamberlains, guys just like Mordecai, Bigvan and Thresh, of those which kept the door, were wore off, as they were mad, and sought to lay hand on King Xerxes. So these 2 guys wanted to kill the king. I don't know why, but they did. And the thing was known to Mordecai. So Mordecai found out about it. Who told it unto Esther the queen. So he passes a message unto her. And Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. So she told the king that her uncle, and I don't know if she called him his uncle then, because she was keeping that a secret, had heard this plot of people that wanted to kill him. All right, and now verse 23. And when the inquisition was made, so they did an investigation, the matter was found out. Yes, it's true what we've been told. Therefore, they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. So these guys got caught. They got hung for being treason against the king. And it got written in this, what they call the book of the Chronicles before the king. These people really like keeping records, right? And we're going to see why that's important here in a little bit while later. All right. Now we get to the important part. And that is this guy. See, here's the king. Guy named Haman. All right. Who's he? Well, he's a guy that's been working for the king. And I guess he's been doing a pretty good job. The king likes him, and the king keeps promoting him from one position to the next, and now he's in one of those top positions, and boy, does he love it, all right? The guys in the top positions got these gold necklaces they wore. I mean, the king got the crown. These guys got the gold necklaces to prove who they were, all right? And you're supposed to honor them almost as much as you honor the king, and he could come and go into the palace. Couldn't go into the courtroom, but he could come to the palace, and he would talk to the king sometimes. The king would give him a job. He really liked this job. There was just one problem. Mordecai wouldn't bow to him. At first, he didn't notice, but then people pointed it out to him. Mordecai doesn't bow when you come through like we're supposed to. Now, I don't know exactly why Mordecai didn't do that. Somehow he knew this guy wasn't worth bowing to. He turns out, oh my, those of you that like to tie everything together. If you remember all the way back with King Saul, God sent him out to stop a king named Agag. He was supposed to kill him right there, but he didn't right away, and the prophet had to come in and bawl him out and kill him for him. That king, Agag, is somehow related here to Haman. Great-grandfather. All right? So he probably hated the Jews already. And Haman found out that Mordecai was a Jew. So here he had the prestige and the power he wanted in his gold necklace and was able to do different things for the king. And this guy wasn't bowing down to him, and it made him mad. And he just didn't want to get rid of Mordecai. He wanted to get rid of, ready for this, all the Jews. All those Hebrews, whether they lived there in Shushan at the palace, or they lived any place else in the entire Persian Empire. He wanted to get rid of them. And he talked the king into making a decree to do that. He said, these people are terrible. They don't worship your God. They worship their own God. They're up to no good. We got to do something about them. Let's just wipe them out. You make the decree. And the king made this decree that said anywhere in my empire, anybody that wants to on this certain day, they gave a date, can come in and kill any of the Jews they want to and take all their property. So burst into their house, kill them, and steal their stuff. They thought that would be a pretty good thing. Haman went home saying, ha, got that problem solved. Well, Mordecai found out about it because this was a empire-wide announcement. Got sent out through their mail system. Everybody heard about it. And Mordecai asked Esther to go to the king and tell him about it and beg for mercy. At this point, Esther still hasn't told the king she's a Jew. There's another problem, though. We need to look at that so you can see just how brave Esther was here. Go to Esther chapter 4 and verse 11. This is what she said when Mordecai told her to go into the king. And all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come into the king, into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law to put him to death, except to such who the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. So even though she's the queen, she's the wife of the king, she hasn't been to see him in a month. And they don't let just anybody in to see the king. The king has his courtroom where he makes his decisions, where he sits on his throne, and the advisors come in and they work out the problem of the kingdom. But not just anybody can come in. You have to be called to come in. And Esther has not been called to see the king in 30 days. And she knows if she goes in there, she could be killed. In fact, that's what they normally did. So she tells Mordecai, you go back to your people, all the Jews you know around here, tell them to fast for 3 days. I'll go back to my apartment in the palace here. Me and my maids will fast for 3 days. And then I will go see the king. And if he kills me, he'll kill me. Let's look at that. In verse 16. Go gather all the Jews that are present in Shushan and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. And I also and my maidens will fast likewise. So I will go into the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. So that's what they did. Fasted for 3 days. She got dressed up in her royal clothes. And she went in to the courtroom, the throne room where the king is. And the king was surprised. All the other people in the courtroom were surprised because they know she hadn't been called. But the king had compassion on her. Again, God was in control, and he had a scepter there, and he held it out to her so they wouldn't kill her. And he said, wow, or something like that. What is it you want? What is it you want to ask from me? He's used to people coming in and asking him things all the time. Well, she decided not to talk to him about the decree there. Too many people in the courtroom. So she instead invites him to come over to her house with Haman that night for a big dinner, a banquet. Now Haman was impressed. He says, the king's coming, and the only other person the queen invites is me. I must be a very important guy. This is flattering. So sure enough, the king and Haman come to her dinner that night, and she serves them a great meal. And she doesn't ask him about the decree that night. Something kept her from doing it. And we're going to see how God works it out. She says, come back tomorrow night. Come back to the dinner tomorrow night. You and Haman here, come back tomorrow night. We'll have another dinner, and then I'll tell you what I want. And the king agreed to that. So the king goes home, and Haman goes home, but he's still upset. Naaman will not bow to him. And his wife gives him an idea. Go in our backyard and build a gallows. You know what a gallows is? Usually this wooden platform, and that's where they hung people. You'll see them in the old Western movies. So they tie the rope around the guy's neck, and then there's a door in the floor that opens up. He built it really high because he wanted to make a point, and he knew he was going to ask the king tomorrow, can I hang Mordecai? And the guy's not bowing to me. The king will let me do it. I'm pretty important after all. The queen invites me to her house. So the next morning, Haman comes in to the king. But that night, something else happens. And this is kind of funny. The king couldn't sleep after he left the banquet. And they would, when he couldn't do that, they would call in one of his servants and they would read those royal records to him. I guess they were so boring they would put you to sleep. All right? So somebody came in, they were reading those royal records to him, and they got to the point where it talked about Mordecai saving the king's life before. That talk thing we had just a little while ago where he told the queen about the guys that wanted to kill him. And the king asked the guy, well, what's written in there that we did for a reward for him? And the guy said, well, nothing. We haven't done anything to reward him yet. So after the king went to sleep that night, he wakes up the next morning and said, what can I do for Mordecai? And he went into his throne room that morning trying to figure it out. And he says, are any of my advisors here? And someone says, well, Haman's out in the outer court. He says, okay, invite Haman in. So Haman comes in. You know, he's got this plan. He's going to ask the king, let me kill Mordecai. But instead the king says, Haman, I got this problem I need your advice with. I got this guy in the kingdom I want to reward. What would you think would be the best way for me to reward somebody? And Haman says, ha, he must be talking about me. After all, I'm his best man. I'm the best guy. The queen invites me for dinner. So he said what he'd want the king to do for him. He says, King, what you need to do is get out your best horse. The white one. The people everybody knows is the king's horse. And you need to get out one of your best robes. Your best robe for being a king. And you take this guy you want to reward, and you put him in the robe, and you set him on the horse, and you have somebody lead him through town shouting out, this is what the king does for the people he wants to reward. Haman thought he'd really like that. Well, can you imagine his surprise? When the king says, yes, that's a great idea. Why don't you take care of that for me? Get my horse, get my robe, put Mordecai on the horse and lead him through town. How do you think he felt that the guy he wanted to ask to kill just got rewarded by the king, and he's the guy that's got to do it? Kind of funny, isn't it? That's how God works these things out. So that's what Haman did all that day. Did that for Mordecai. He comes back. Mordecai goes right back to the same job he had there at the door. Haman is fuming mad. Goes back home, gets ready for the dinner. Because this will be the second dinner he's going to have here. And he and the king go off to see Esther. So when they see Esther, they have the dinner. And the king says, okay, Esther, I'd like to give you something. What is it that you want that you've been giving us these dinners for? And then she tells him. She asks him, can you spare my life? Can you spare the life of my people? because this Haman guy here wants to kill us. He's the one that has this decree. It's going to kill me and it's going to kill my people. Can you stop it? Can you just imagine Haman there choking on his piece of apple pie he's having for dessert? Yep. He's upset. He knows he's in trouble now. The king goes off mad and confused. What's he going to do about this? His wife's a Jew. He's got this decree saying the Jews have to be killed. What do we do with Haman? Haman realizes he's in a very bad spot. You could die for things like this, of getting the king mad at you like this. And he's begging Esther to beg for the king not to kill him. And when the king comes back and sees him begging from Esther, he thinks something's going on, and he then is mad at Haman there. And the people said, well, Haman just built this gallows in his backyard. We could hang him on that. And he said, yeah, go do that. So that's how Haman dies. He gets taken and hugged by his own gallows. He was expecting to hang Mordecai on, the guy he was so mad at. All right? Now the king had another problem. Back then when he wrote a law, that was it. You go back to the Babylonian Empire, Nebuchadnezzar could change his mind from one day to the next. He was king and he could change the rules. He could punish you just because of the way he didn't like you looking. When we got to the end of Daniel's life there and he was in the lion's den, that king couldn't change the rules. He could make them, but he couldn't change them. That's why Daniel had to go in the lion den. We got the same problem here. He couldn't actually just call the whole thing off. So what could they do? The king called in Mordecai and Esther and told them to write something to fix this. And he gave them their ring, his ring. Back then the king's ring had a special engraved section on it. And when they wrote an official decree like this, they take all the copies and they drip hot wax on them from a candle. And then they take the ring and they would stamp it. And then everybody that got a copy of that would know it's the official word from the king. So Esther and Mordecai made a new law that on this certain date, when they were supposed to all be killed and stuff taken away, that they were allowed to get together and go after their enemies and kill them. And that's what happened on those days. Instead of the Jews being wiped out, they got to take care of other enemies that were against them on that day. God worked it all out. The Jews still celebrate this happening. They have a feast that the Orthodox Jews still keep today. They call it Purim. And they still celebrate it every year to remember what God did for them at this time. So what do we see in this story? Once again, God's in control. Once again, he saves the Jewish people because of the promises he's made, if nothing else. They're his special people. He's saving them because if that decree would have been carried out, it wouldn't have just killed Esther. It wouldn't have just killed Mordecai. It wouldn't have just killed the people living there in the king's palace and in Shushan. It would have killed all the people in that king's empire, which reached all the way back home to Jerusalem. And if that would have happened, there wouldn't have been another country of Israel for the Jews to live in by the time Jesus comes. And God couldn't have kept his promise to Abraham that Abraham would be a blessing to the whole world someday. God wouldn't have been able to keep his promise he made to David that one day one of his descendants would rule the throne in Jerusalem forever. But God was in control. God again took care of it so that he could go on and keep his promises. All right. So if you come and join us this next Sunday, we'll pick up right where we left off in our Sunday school class. Miss Shelley will be teaching this Sunday. If you can't come to Sunday school, send an email to myself or Pastor Jeremy, and we'll make sure you get a link to the video that we're going to try and record on Sunday mornings. Now, you won't get it Sunday probably. It might be later in the week, but you can keep up with the Sunday school lessons. And we'd love to do that for you too if you're not coming in. All right? But until then, I will pray, and we will see you soon. Heavenly Father, we thank you we can look in your word again today. We can see you working. We can see that you're in control and taking care of working out your will in the lives of people and in the lives of the world here, and eventually keeping your promises to us to send us Jesus to save us from our sins. In thy name, amen.